Welcome back to Mike and Mundo. We're glad to have you with us. And first and foremost, we want to express our appreciation to you folks for your feedback and your comments. Now, this is episode 3, and it's going to address protective custody and sensitive needs yards.
SNY.
SNY, yeah, otherwise known as SNY. And, I've been in protective custody, and I've been on sensitive needs yard, both. I question the value across the board. There are a multitude of reasons why an individual goes into protective custody. Perhaps you'd like to address that.
Yeah, a little backdrop, a little history on how that all started. I remember a time when there was no real protective custody unit in the prison system or in the youth authority where I was raised, so to speak. There were places where they would house people temporarily until they got them to a facility that was more conducive to being protected. But we would use the term PC back in the day for protective custody. And there was a play on that I'd like to break down for people that are familiar with modern terminology. In the California prison system, PC, of course, stood for protective custody. In Spanish, the term peseta, which is a derivative of PC, the Spanish pronunciation of the letters P and C for protective custody, stood for the pesetas. They called PC in Spanish pesetas. Pesetas has another meaning in Spanish. It's a slang term for quarters. A quarter being, of course, 25 cents. Hence the term 25ers or pesetas, which is a prison gang that derived in your time frame, Mike, along with others from inmates that were in sensitive needs yards. But getting back to the protective custody, so when people would lock up, that was a term we would use. When they would lock up, they were seeking protective custody for various reasons. Most of the time they were in trouble with a prison gang or there was something they had done to get them in the on a green light list or in the hat, as people would say. So that would mean that they were targeted to be hit.
Yeah, I haven't heard that term in a while. In the hat?
Right.
Yeah. I've heard green light, in contemporary terms and what that means, but to be in the hat, that goes back to...
I'm sure you remember that. Yeah, he's in the hat. Yeah. And my recollection of that is was with the Aryan Brotherhood guys. They would use certain slang that was adopted by everybody in the prison system, and we did the same thing. Like we came up with the term sending somebody to Brazil, which meant sending him home or killing him. It was a flamboyant way of expressing the execution of somebody, the homicide of someone. So we had our own crazy way, our zany way of expressing things, and in the hat was one of them.
That doesn't even account for the carny talk that we developed amongst ourselves. Push and pulls on the ball and chalk, the bulls on the walk.
Yeah.
The lady from Bristol was the pistol, and so on.
Sure, yeah, the notches and... how many notches did he have, and which translate into how many homicides. And so we had our own, when Mike talks about carny talk, he's talking about carnival talk, which was a way we express ourselves in a so-called inmate code or a jargon that was not understood by the prison guards. I mean, if you're dumb enough to continue using that same exact carnival talk for years and years and years, of course, they're going to become proficient at understanding what it means, and they can become experts at deciphering our talk. But that's the way it worked. And so protective custody, there was an evolvement of protective custody inmates. I remember when I made the decision to pull away from my lifestyle, when I came back into custody to serve a term for 2 homicides that I had committed, I ended up in Tehachapi in the restricted housing unit, RHU, and you're familiar with this unit, Mike. And at that time, there were 13 cells to that unit. Everybody in that unit was a dropout, a prison gang dropout. And if I'm not mistaken, I think everybody was actively testifying in a case or had already debriefed. And I know that debriefing has and had a negative connotation in the underworld, in the prison gang world, in the street gang world, to debrief, to drop out, to turn snitch, whatever you want to call it. To me, they're all the same. Once you drop out, once you give up something to get you in protective custody, you're no good.
Right.
You're a snitch, so to speak, looking at it through their eyes. So anybody that says, oh, I'm not as bad as Mike Thompson or as Mundo, who testified in court, all I did, I didn't quite raise my right hand all the way up, I went halfway. Well, come on. Try explaining that to the prison gangs.
What we used to call that, dry snitching?
Dry snitching.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. You're either in or you're out.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I turned and I arrived in the RHU unit, once again, it was restricted to 13 cells. There were guys there from the Mexican Mafia, dropouts. There was Sailor Boy. There was Richie Reese from Bakersfield. There were several guys. There was Bobby Butler from the Aryan Brotherhood, Ronnie Harper, guys that you remember.
Yeah.
There was Dean Lakey.
Right. Now, I just missed you. You left in 83, and I arrived in 83.
Right.
But our paths just missed each other. And at that time, Dean and others had already left. You had Fat Jack Burt. He was international president of the Vagos. And Ronnie was still there with Jerry Hendershot. And you had Nino Marmolejo, a Mexican Mafia. And Steve Barnes, whose father was executed by the Aryan Brotherhood, and was one of the reasons for my actually stepping away from the Aryan Brotherhood. But it was the only unit of its kind in the state of California.
Well, look at the contrast.
Yeah.
We've talked about that in private. We went from overseeing facilitators under our umbrella. You had Caucasian or white inmates that identified white under your authority, and I was a member of a group, Mexican Mafia, that had Sureños or Southern California gang members under our authority. We went from that status, from the top of the food chain, as I would describe us, to suddenly becoming targeted ourselves. And so it's the contrast of being a career criminal and being a tough guy to suddenly entering protective custody. And I think what a lot of people don't get is when they talk about people that turn, they think or they love the narrative that we are no longer men. We lost our manhood. We lost our ability to be aggressive. There's a host of things that are always mentioned with that regard. And of course, I think what happens once you enter protective custody and you realize that this is a new life, a new way of proceeding, I think everybody has already thought it out. You've already thought it out. You thought yours out for a little bit, whatever time it was. I thought mine out in my situation. And then we made a decision, understanding that it was a radical decision. Just like the decision to become a tough guy and take a death oath by joining the gang that we joined. That was a gradual thing, a gradual transition in life. Now we're faced with a situation where we're making another decision, not dissimilar to the other, to come back from a radical life, to turn away from a life. So when you do that, there is a little bit with everybody, and it'll vary from person to person. There's a little bit of a shock, just because of the nature of changing. I don't know about you, and I know you can talk about it, Mike, but I had immediate adaptation to my new status.
Mm-hmm.
I felt relief. I felt like a 1,000-pound brick was taken off my shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
And not because I was being looked upon to do something that I didn't want to do. I felt
Right.
pressure from above, because there was no above in my time frame.
Mm-hmm.
There was nobody higher than me. I was the one that put the burden on myself.
Mm-hmm.
I led by example. Whatever I would tell people in my organization that we should do, I wanted to be, and I always was, on the front lines.
Mm-hmm.
The guys knew it, our enemies knew it, and consequently, I was always a member in high standing.
Right.
Until the day, so they never saw it coming.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you have a similar
I do, yeah.
situation.
I mean, that resonates with me. You know, the very idea that you know that you're in absolute control, you're in charge, and you are leading by example. For me, and I'm thinking it's perhaps similar to your own story. That example did not include the taking of innocent life. That's not something that I could condone or would condone.
Right.
And that was really the motivation behind my stepping away from the brand. Now, and like you, there was no identity crisis on my part. My integrity was intact. I knew then and know now who I am. You know, what my beliefs are and why they are my beliefs. And that's actually what led me to make the decision that I did. So it was a choice. I made that choice. I made the decision. I don't believe in regrets. As it relates to that, I don't see any value in that. I felt perfectly comfortable in what I was doing. The only distinction that I did make, you know, like you know, the moment you make that decision, you're swamped with law enforcement who want intelligence and this and that, and so more choices have to be made as it relates to that. And I made those choices. There were certain things that I would not discuss. And that was because it involved families, and I did not believe that those families deserved to be involved in that ethical upheaval, simply because I had made a decision to take a stand for something.
Right.
And I very rarely take a stand against something, but I will take a stand for what I refer to as an ethical imperative. And in this case, it was the taking of innocent life.
Now, for the people that are listening, whether they've joined a gang or whether they're actively in a gang right now, some may be contemplating leaving the life and others may not. But what would you say to them about this notion that we betrayed, or that in your case, speaking of your experience, that you betrayed your fellow brothers in the Aryan Brotherhood?
Yeah, I understand where that perspective comes from. I mean, it's subjective on the part of the individuals that are espousing that. The truth of the matter is I betrayed my family. You see,
And yourself.
and myself. But who brought that to bear upon my own consciousness were my elders. Because they approached me in San Quentin and they flat told me, they said, look, we know the way you were raised, and the life that you're leading right now is not conducive to that. You're living two truths. And they told me, choose. Now, that was part of the reason, for me looking at other instances like the taking of innocent life in conjunction with what the elders had told me. There was the death of Margot Compton and her 2 6-year-old daughters, at the hands of the Hells Angels. Now, I testified in that case. I've testified in numerous cases, actually, where particularly it involved the taking of innocent life. But those were all factors that led me to the decision that I could not condone this type of lifestyle. It didn't change me, and I'm sure it didn't change you as a man. I've never embraced that thinking. Those who do is usually a fear-based mentality. and are very insecure in their own sense of identity or otherwise. I didn't have that problem. For me, it was a very simple thing, a very easy thing, and I executed it immediately. There are those that I know of who have had difficulty, oftentimes thrown into what's referred to as an identity crisis, as if now, as you correctly pointed out, their manhood is in question, their identity is in question, their values are in question, their belief system is in question, and as my elder used to say, that's putting a little bit too much ha-ha on it.
Yeah.
Oftentimes what they're concerned with is what others think of them. And, you know, I've long held the belief that what others think of me is none of my damn business.
I like to talk about, Mike, I like to talk about 3 predominant reasons that people turn. Now, there's many others.
Oh, yeah.
But 3 predominant reasons that people turn are, number 1, they're in trouble with the fellas, with their organization. In your case, you were at the highest standing possible.
Right.
Same thing with me. I had just been arrested for 2 homicides, a rival prison gang member and his brother. Others I had gotten away with, was never prosecuted, never arrested. So I was at the highest possible standing within my organization. Number 2, there's a female, a wife, a girlfriend, somebody out there that you don't want to lose. So, you know, you hear about guys that decide to flip because they don't want to lose their girl. Number 3, doing time, doing too much time. I had no problem doing time. I enjoyed it. I loved doing time. You know, it was like a red carpet treatment. I mean, as sick as this sounds, I almost subconsciously could not wait to get back in custody, to be with my brothers, with the people I knew that I was state raised with.
Well, I understand it. I mean, you're living large.
Yeah.
You see, what people don't understand is that particularly back then in our time, we had everything we wanted.
Right.
I mean, you name it. There wasn't anything.
You called it control of your resources.
Well, yeah, that's
I love.
Yeah, well, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
And I also call it the effective utilization of resources.
Right.
So that, I mean, any and everything you want. There isn't anything on the outside that you can't have on the inside.
Yeah.
Is really what it comes down to. I mean, the freedom of movement, yeah, you're living in a controlled environment, but as you correctly point out, you're living with individuals of your ilk.
And people don't understand that this status is what many in the gang world seek to attain.
Yes.
I call it, I often describe it as climbing criminal Mount Everest. and we made it to the top.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. I mean, or fortunately now because we're out of it,
right.
You know, but I'm saying we made it to the top of the food chain. And as I say this, and I emphasize it, I only say this because I want to contrast who we were and who we are now.
Right.
And in addition to that, I want to demonstrate that somebody who reaches the pinnacle of depravity, as Mike and I did, most of you that are viewing, the vast majority of you, I would say 99.9% of you, if not higher, will never reach the pinnacle of the depravity that we attained. That's not a good thing. That's not an honorable thing. That's nothing to boast about.
No, it's not.
But that is a fact. So as I say this, I'm saying you're not even going to reach there. That you're not even going to come close to attaining that. And yet, if those of you who are considering continuing in that life or entering that life, take it from us. It's a big lie to begin with. It's a lie from the pit of hell. And it's like the analogy I give, it's like being on a runaway truck going downhill that the brakes have failed and it's going to crash. So your only option is to bail.
Well, that goes back to that idea, too, of effective utilization of resources, you know, the construct of expendability, those individuals who are expendable.
Right.
And that's what a lot of youngsters don't understand, is that they're being recruited into the gangs because they are expendable.
Totally.
You see, and oftentimes they find that out, unfortunately, the hard way. But you and I were in a position to bring these individuals in, cultivate them in that capacity so that they could be used in a torpedo mission.
We were the puppet masters.
That's right.
And we had the puppets doing what we wanted them to do. And you wake up on the wrong side of the bed. I always talk about Alfie Sosa, the monster that everybody says I created as a trigger man on the streets. When Alfie, somebody like an Alfie Sosa, or you could use one of your guys, you know, a Ronald Harper, a Barry Mills, whoever, wakes up on the wrong side of the bed and starts thinking about somebody that we're using as a loyal facilitator, and they bring up the fact that this person knows too much and could be detrimental to our organization. Do we have somebody that can replace him or her? If so, we're talking about the expendability.
Yeah, what are your options?
Exactly.
And you're constantly looking at that, and that's part of running an outfit, you see, is to understand what you're dealing with and why, what the consequences are, how that paradigm shifts, you know. And you've made reference previously to the fact that the pendulum as it relates to
punishment and rehabilitation.
Punishment and rehabilitation, you know, we've watched it swing back and forth. Well, that applies to almost everything that occurs within a controlled environment. That pendulum swings back and forth depending on the politic associated with the administration, the politics of the various gangs within a specific or particular institution. All those things matter. And the key is to stay on top of that.
Yeah.
So that's what I meant by the effective utilization of your resources.
Right.
And those individuals that are recruited into the organization for the sole purpose of sending them on a mission, suicide mission, torpedo mission, call it what you want. It's putting them out front of the organization because they're expendable, and only that. And we see that a lot today. You know, with the various gangs, with the various organizations, you're always going to have that. And, you know, that not only applies to associates, but, you know, the wannabes, you got a ton of wannabes, you know, that psychologically you're going to use them. You know, because they want to be that guy for whatever reason. And so we're going to take advantage of that and have taken advantage of that.
So now we're back on this protective custody and SNY topic. And I don't care if you're an Italian mobster, an Irish mobster, a Puerto Rican gang member, El Salvadoran MS-13. It doesn't matter where in the country you are. When you seek protective custody, when you snitch, either way, when you leave that world, you lose your status, you become a target, you become green lit. In other words, you're earmarked for execution. There is no honor in their world. Remember that. I'm emphasizing in their world, looking at it through their prism. There's no honor in defecting from that lifestyle. So protective custody has a negative tune, negative ring, whether you're in the Bureau of Prisons. They have WITSEC units inside the federal prison system. You have other keep-away locations where they put people who are in trouble, who are targeted. It's a little more organized the way they do it in California. I think you remember the White Elephant. The White Elephant was a prison in Chino.
That's right.
With hundreds of protective housing units. And as time went by and as the prison gangs took control of the prisons, all the various groups that were doing their thing, you started developing sensitive needs yards. And that's, before I get to, as we continue this conversation and talk about the reasons, the benefits of being in an SNY yard, you had the experience of being in an SNY.
I did, yeah. I was in I was in the restricted housing unit for 10 years, and then the Department of Corrections built a protective housing unit in Corcoran. Corcoran had just been built, and they had 2 protective housing units in Soledad, and both were full. I mean, they had a lot of prisoners in it. So they did a vetting process, and from those 2 huge units, they selected Charlie Manson, Sirhan, and Juan Corona, those 3. And they moved them to the protective housing unit there in Corcoran. Now, those of us that were in the restricted housing unit, I think there were 5 of us at the time. They moved us into that protective housing unit. So now we're this, in total, I think, when all was said and done, there were about 13 of us in the protective housing unit at Corcoran. And, we all had jobs, and there was a lot going on relative to that. But it was a level 4 facility. And you lived, for lack of a better term, in solitary confinement, unless the gates were racked and you were allowed to come out and work and so on. But after 10 years there, I'd had enough. It was just, I didn't really care for the individuals that I was there with. They had the guards on the yard had started this outfit called the Sharks, later referred to as the Green Wall. You had gladiator fights going on where...
Setting up inmates.
I know 8 deaths there. And, one of which I actually witnessed because I was working as the captain's clerk. And this individual was set up, shot in the head, and I was the clerk that was doing the paperwork on it, and I saw it for what it was, took it to the captain, he took it to the FBI, they indicted 8 guards, and at that point, it was a mess. So I got a hold of director of institutions up in Sacramento, and I'd heard about this sensitive needs yard, and requested that I be removed from the protective housing unit to a sensitive needs yard, so that I could engage in more programming and pursue other activities. Not the least of which was a sweat lodge, because at the protective housing unit, while they gave me an area to practice my ways, I wasn't actually able to construct a sweat lodge. So I was moved to the SNY, and one of the first things that I noticed there was that you had individuals who were locking up for a wide variety of reasons, many of them ex-gang members.
Right.
And what astounded me was that they were attempting to reestablish themselves with a new gang. That's where the 2-5 came from.
Sure.
In that. And so it reached a point where you had more murders occurring on the SNY than you did in the general population.
Right.
They were more of a problem. They created more of a problem for the Department of Corrections than they were having on general population yards. And, in Lancaster, I saw an opportunity there. And so I took that opportunity. I mean, I had the last attempt on my life was at an SNY.
Yeah,
and,
what happened there? Yeah, you mentioned somebody, you had a sleeper that entered.
Yeah, and then, that's what a lot of people don't talk about. But very briefly, a sleeper is somebody who's cultivated by the gangs to...
infiltrate.
To lock up and then infiltrate the SNY. So it's with the blessing of the gang, if you will, and he's cultivated that way. He goes through all the motions, the debriefing process and everything else. He's moved to an SNY where hopefully the gang has a target, and then they move on that target. In my case, we had an individual who had essentially done just that. He aligned himself with the natives, and I was raised Native and was practicing Native, and so came to know him in that way. But at one point I was working a double shift, and I'd just gotten off work, and I was helping an individual prepare to go to the board for the next day. And this fella got a roundhouse kick in, come up from behind me, and he had a box cutter. He grabbed me by the hair, reached in to cut my throat, and I was semi-unconscious. I couldn't see, but I could hear. So I blocked it. He cut my ear in half. Second attempt, he cut the back of my throat, even though I still blocked it. But on the third, I got my eyesight back, took the weapon away from him. And, in an instant, I knew that I could break his neck. But I chose not to. And I put the piece up underneath me and waited for staff to respond. Now, I had been working with the prisoners there on the yard in a program, especially the gang dropouts, to give them an opportunity to evolve, not only in their humanity, but to step away from drug addiction, to socialize them insofar as preparing them to go back out to the streets and so on. And the fact that I had not used the weapon against my assailant had a huge impact upon the population. That led eventually to me going to another facility and becoming an alcohol and drug counselor. But the real issue behind telling this story is that with that attempt on my life, I was placed in a hole. Right. And, I got a hold of the warden, because the warden and his wife were part of my program. And I got a hold of the warden, and I asked him to come see me, and he did. And I said, I knew that they were going to try to keep me off the yard. And I literally begged him to put me back on the yard because of the impact of keeping me off the yard that would have on the morale of the individuals that were still there. And he agreed with me and let me back out on the yard so that I could walk the yard and allow others to see that, via the choice that I made not to engage my assailant, this is the consequence. You see, now my assailant, of course, was locked up and ultimately convicted of his assault upon me.
I marvel at what you did there or what you did not do, because it took some maturing in your case, being away from that life, not reacting in a violent nature. I don't think you're espousing or encouraging anyone to not respond to violence with violence if you have to protect yourself.
Right, exactly.
I don't think you're saying that.
No.
But you had the presence of mind to recognize that A, you weren't dead, B, whether or not you were going to survive, you had control of the situation and you handled it the way you did. I don't think that I could have, just being honest, handled it the way you did. I think I probably would have responded with similar violence. Once I got a hold of the box cutter, I probably would have went for his jugular. But with that said, I don't know. I don't know that. It depends on my maturity.
Well, it occurred to me. I mean, there was an instant there, a nanosecond, if you will, where I knew I could break his neck and was going to. But the fact of the matter is, and the truth of the matter is I heard my wife's voice in my head say, "No, Sky."
Wow.
And that was enough for me.
Yeah.
So, and that was, really the bottom line to it. I mean, because this youngster was putting hands on me. I mean, he was doing a job. I'll give him his props on that.
Yeah.
He was doing what he was supposed to be doing.
Sure.
But
I had a similar, not violent confrontation, but I had a similar situation that occurred. I was testifying in a preliminary hearing against Joe Morgan. Joe Morgan was one of the most influential Mexican mafia guys. He ended up going, as a result of my testimony, he ended up going to prison for life, and he passed away behind bars. Okay, so when I'm testifying in his case, his attorney asked me a question. He asked me if I feared for the safety of my family, and to me that was something that question was made to intimidate me, and it was posed for that purpose. I looked over at Joe. He ignored my eyes. I looked back at the attorney and I told him with calculation, I said, as far as I'm concerned, my trigger finger isn't broken and we all have families.
Yeah.
So that was my way of communicating to Joe that you mess with my family, I know where your mom lives, I know where your sister lives, I can take them out just like you would take my family out. Now, in reality, in my heart of hearts, I knew then that I would never do that.
Right.
Because it wouldn't bring my family member or members back. But I wanted Joe, based on my past, and Joe knew about my past, I wanted Joe to think that I would gladly and easily revert to who I was if he touched a member of my family.
Yeah.
So that was
No, I understand the psychology of that.
Yeah.
I had same thing happened to me with the Hells Angels.
Yeah.
In testifying against them with Sonny Barger.
Sure.
And they'd rolled up on my wife, and there was a associate warden and a captain at the facility I was at, and they had me on a speakerphone, and I was supposed to be hearing all this, and this was supposed to be a deterrent toward me testifying against the individuals who had killed Marco Compton and her 2 6-year-old twin daughters.
Right.
And but
see, now in fairness, now to what we're talking about in this regard, the beauty of the mission statement, if you can call it that, of the Aryan Brotherhood and the Mexican Mafia and most gangs throughout the country even, you got to be pretty demented otherwise, is that children, family members, unless you're a male adult, okay, family members, mothers, grandparents, whatever, are typically off limits.
Yes.
I know you went through your situation where your gang was considering that, and in fact did carry one out.
Yes.
But I think today that's not their mission statement anymore, and I think they kind of copy and paste each other. They learn from other organized groups, and they also learn from other inmates within the system. And they set down their laws and say, look, this is off limits.
Well, when I left because of that, amongst other reasons, there were a number of other AB members who left right after me for the same reasons, because they also would not condone that. So it doesn't surprise me to learn that, they've stepped away from that completely. I mean, it goes completely contrary to everything that they profess to be.
So the caliber of inmates in the SNY yards, the sensitive needs yards today, are guys that have been not far removed from extreme violence, from doing the things that we did back in our days, from following orders. Most of them are guys that followed orders, and conducting all that crazy, violent business. Now they find themselves in a situation where they're in protective custody. I mean, that term, sensitive need yards, I mean, it sounds like a woman on her period or something, sensitive needs. But without making fun of that, these guys, they have an opportunity. It's almost like they've been handed a gift from above.
Yes, they have.
Right? And that gift is, look, you were not killed. Nothing bad happened to you or your loved ones. You are in a position now to redirect your life, to turn, to do something positive, to put a smile on your mother's face, to put a smile on the members of your family that love you. They love you, right? And you look at all the families that are advocates for the bad guys.
Yeah.
They're unwitting co-conspirators. They're utilized, unfortunately, by their own kids, their own family members behind bars to do their bidding on the outside. When I say unwitting, obviously they're not killing people. Obviously they're majority of them are not selling dope or doing any of that, but they're conduits, they're facilitators.
Well, brother, what you're really talking about is an opportunity bias here, because they're coming from a situation where, we talked about the identity crisis and everything else, but I'll give it to the Department of Corrections. On these sensitive needs yards, they had all kinds of programs. I mean, education programs, social programs, addiction programs, self-help programs, you name it. I mean, San Quentin's famous for it. But you have a number of prisons like that. So the opportunity from something negative, that negative connotation of stepping away from a gang, you see, and coming to a facility where now you have an opportunity, see, to embrace your family again and embrace yourself.
Right.
You see, to evolve in your humanity and to do all those things that you otherwise would have done had you not become a member of a gang.
Yeah.
And that's the opportunity in this.
Oh, big time opportunity to
that's the best I can say about an SNY. I mean, I think the vetting process that they use is faulty. Because they're not looking when these individuals are starting gangs. They know what's going on.
Yeah.
When you have a level of violence that becomes twofold of what it is in a general population, you have a problem. You see, so those are individuals that need to be dealt with, and unfortunately aren't. And as a result, people suffer. So there's always that element for certain individuals of fear.
Yeah.
And, we both know that, fear is essentially at the root of at least half the things that go on within a controlled environment.
As a dropout, as a person behind bars that in effect has been converted into a leper. You become a leper in the eyes of the gang members. Okay, so you are never going to be accepted by that underworld. Never. You're done.
Yeah.
Okay, in that regard. And again, to me, that's a blessing.
Yes.
Okay, not a negative thing. It's a blessing. So when these guys, rather than look at it as a blessing, endeavor to perpetuate their life of being a criminal and in effect creating a new gang and living that lifestyle, they're never going to be able to return to who they were as far as the status goes.
Right.
Never. It's not going to happen. So they're perpetuating and creating their own lie by creating these kind of gangs. It's not about, well, we're better than these guys, but yet we're still criminals and we're
I've
still
heard that
gang
argument.
members. Yeah, I'm sure.
I'm this or we're this, but they're that. You see, and one of the things about sensitive needs yards is that you had a lot of individuals who belong to the LGBTQ community.
Yes.
And as such, were seen as vulnerable. Then you also had, for instance, the facility that I paroled from, Chino, where I was working as an alcohol and drug counselor, was an SNY. But probably 65% of that population were child molesters. And that's a difficult thing to deal with.
Right.
I did a lot of groups relative to that, and that's, you and I have talked previously about the death penalty and otherwise, and, that's one area where I kind of hold on to the idea that if you're going to use a punishment like that, that's the type of individual that you're going to use it against, or lacking that you're going to lock them up for the rest of their life. Point is that on this SNY, you had these individuals so that when you have a gang dropout come into an environment like that, now suddenly, remember the code. Code is that when a child molester comes on the yard, you kill him. You see, now you're coming to a yard where 65% of the population are child molesters. You see, and you're in the mix with them. And that becomes a part of who you are and how staff respond to you and otherwise.
Oh, get me off that yard.
You're going out to the visiting area, and you're sitting there with your family, and you're surrounded by individuals that you know what their crime is.
Of course.
You see, and your children are there visiting you. That created so many conflicts.
Right.
And I understand why. I mean, I get it. But, that's just part of the dynamic of an SNY, where you bring an individual that was in the mix, now he's amongst child molesters, and homosexuals, queens, you name it.
Right.
And so that's oftentimes where that identity crisis comes from.
Yeah.
It's just that. And if they lack the maturity that you were talking about, then it becomes tenfold.
So you're an SNY inmate, and you wish to resurrect your life as a gang member. You want to return to that life.
Right.
And you get a message from a active prison gang guy or a gang member telling you, if you want to be in good with us, take out so-and-so, stab him for us.
Yeah.
And so some knuckleheads will probably buy into that.
Oh, they do.
And they don't realize they're being played out the box.
But the issue there is shame. You see, the very idea that they stepped away, I mean, I've talked to you about Blue Norris. And the idea that he took his own life because, he stepped away from the brand.
Right.
He came to an SNY, and he simply could not adjust.
Couldn't accept it, yeah.
So he killed himself. He put a piece on the wall and...
Harry Carey.
Ran it into his heart.
Yeah.
And I get it. I understand it. You see, that's the identity crisis. That's the extent to which that identity crisis goes to.
And you know, I'm sure you knew Little Mo Farrell.
Oh, yeah.
Little Mo Farrell suffered, he whipped Alfie. Alfie was always getting whipped by the brothers over him running his mouth. So he got into it with Mo. Mo whipped him, created an internal rift about you don't lift a hand against a fellow brother. They sent 3 guys to get him. One guy held the cell door closed while the other 2 stabbed him repeatedly. When he woke up, he was in ICU in a hospital in Sacramento. And who was next to him? Blue Norse.
Yeah.
And he was there. And when he woke up and saw that he had been on life support, and he remembered why they hit him and the fact that he was no longer a brother, he told Blue, if I can't be a carnal, a brother, then I don't want to live.
Yeah.
And he pulled the life support, pulled all the tubes from his body, and he died.
Yeah.
So there you go. I mean, you got similar guys that just cannot handle being in that type of status because they are so far gone. They've been brainwashed. This is the status that they live for. I mean, it's terrible to think. I know the average citizen will say, "Well, good, you got another bad guy off the streets." Okay, maybe there's some truth to that, but I still maintain that some of these guys, there's still the avenue of forgiveness. There's still the avenue of coming back.
Well, and I think that's appropriate. You know, we're the Department of Corrections, I think, in recognizing the very things that we're talking about here, insofar as an SNY essentially being dysfunctional, is that they're beginning to develop these integrated yards. And I think that's probably going to work better because what it does is it brings the person back out into a general population environment. And what it removes from that environment are the gangbangers and otherwise. So they are incorporating a vetting process. It isn't to say that people still won't slip through and that people still aren't going to attempt to get in the mix and otherwise.
So who are they integrating them with? The SNYs are being integrated
with general population.
Which includes active Sureños.
Well, see, that's the whole point. That's the vetting process on the part of the department, and I'll give them their props for that. On the part of the Department of Corrections, is that they validate gang members, so they know who the gang members are, who their associates are, and otherwise. So what they're doing is they're taking those individuals and they're moving them to level 4s. Because that's their choice. They want to do, they want to be in the mix, do it on a level 4. Then they're taking the integrated inmates and they're putting them on a level 3 and a level 2. Where the custody classification isn't as high, and it looks like it's going to work. It's going to take some time.
Right.
But I think it's a vastly superior program than that of the sensitive needs yard.
But it's always come down to classification, I would think.
It does, yes.
Right?
Yes.
You would think, instead of having
No,
whatever...
the department can't get away from that, unfortunately, is the classification process. Custody-wise, you see, is a key element here.
Sure.
And they have a point system to facilitate that.
And then you wouldn't want to put an ex-cop or a child molester on the same yard with General Pop.
Right.
Because you got somebody that's going to make a name for himself.
Right, but they're actually attempting to do that, you see. And I think what they're going to do is that they're going to make, like you take Chino, and the Chino I'm actually talking about at one time was the white elephant. You see, it just converted back to a level 2 where it had programs and otherwise. But
let me ask you this. So if you're going to vet, rightfully so, an active gang member, and once you determine that he's classified as an active gang member, subservient to one of the gangs, you place him in a level 4 yard, what about the SNY inmate who's predisposed to being a member of one of the SNY gangs and perpetuating that kind of...
Yeah, believe it or not, they actually know that. I mean, it's the department does a pretty good job of utilizing what I refer to as conduits. And those conduits are individuals who provide them with information about who's who and what they're doing and otherwise. Traditionally, your homosexuals were good at that. It's usually referred to as pillow talk. So that if an individual was engaged with a homosexual in a sexual relationship, then they're picking up information, they're feeding that back via that conduit to staff. So they have numerous methods to derive information about the population, what's going on within the population. The only thing they've been lacking in that I can see, and I don't really mean this as a criticism, but rather as an observation, is the introduction of fentanyl into the institutions. It's taken a lot of lives, particularly on the SNY yards here in recent years.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. What a sensitive topic. We've touched on some of the intricacies of doing time in a separate reality in prison. It's you have your protective custody, sensitive needs inmates, and we thank you all for tuning in. And thank you, Mike, for sharing your experiences and.
Yeah, well, likewise, brother, and I want to emphasize, of course, to our viewers that we appreciate their feedback, their comments, and please continue to do so. It's deeply appreciated.
Yep.
You folks take care.
God bless you.